Good morning. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Welcome to today's news conference on the pardons legislation to address criminal justice system inequities and keeping communities safe. Bienvenue aux conférences de presse concernant le projet de loi sur les pardons visant à remédier les inégalités du système de justice pénale et assurer la sécurité des communautés. The Honorable Bill Blair, Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, the Honorable Bardish Chagger, Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, and Joël Lightbound, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, will each deliver remarks, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Ministre Blair. Minister Blair, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you all today from my home, which is located in the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit. I'm very pleased today to be joined by my colleagues, Minister Bardish Chagger and Parliamentary Secretary Joël Lightbound, in presenting what we believe to be a very important initiative. I'd also like to begin by giving specific mention to my colleagues, Gary Anandasangari, Greg Fergus, and Pam Damoff, for their continued advocacy and leadership on this file. And I'd also like to acknowledge the many community organizations whose strong advocacy have contributed so much to the government's work in this area. Today, we are announcing important changes that will impact upon the criminal justice system. I'd like to speak, if I may, begin by speaking about a little bit about criminal records in Canada. First of all, I think it's important to understand that it's not unusual for Canadians to have a criminal record. In fact, approximately 10% of all Canadians have a criminal record for which they have not yet received a record suspension or, as is far more commonly known, a pardon. And in fact, 74% of Canadians who have these criminal records have actually never served a day in jail. But they carry the burden of those records throughout their life, and those burdens can have a huge impact on their ability to live fully contributing and appropriate lives. And so that's one of the things that we believe that needs to be changed. There's a real and lasting stigma that can attach to those records. And criminal records can, in fact, be a barrier to employment, to travel, to education, to application to housing, even for the opportunity to contribute and to volunteer within your community. And that's why so many Canadians seek to have their records suspended or pardons. Pardons allow people who have been convicted of a criminal offense to have their criminal records kept separate, provided that they are eligible, they have completed their sentence, and they have met the wait period, and of course demonstrated that they are now law-abiding. And that means if you have obtained a pardon, you will not be impeded if you apply for a job or a placement in a school or for housing, that you'll be able to travel, that you'll be able to volunteer in your communities, with some very important exceptions, of course, that we have kept in place to protect society. There are very many benefits to this process. For one, it allows for the safe and successful reintegration of people who have criminal records back into society so that they can contribute as productive people. It also improves public safety because successful and safe reintegration means reduced reoffending and reduced victimization. Between 2010 and 2012, very significant changes were made to the Criminal Records Act that had an unfortunate effect of significantly limiting the access that Canadians had to a pardon. These changes lengthened waiting periods for individuals before they could apply for the pardon, and they meant a very significant increase in the cost of the application fee, from $50 in 2010 to $631 by 2012. And due to the annual increase to the fee that is required by the Service Fee Act, the current cost to apply for a pardon in Canada is $657.77. As an unfortunate consequence of those measures, we've seen a significant reduction in the number of applications that Canadians have been able to make for a pardon, a 57% reduction in pardon applications. And this is because they were made financially inaccessible for so many people. And unfortunately, that has had a disparate impact on racialized people and Indigenous people in this country who are disproportionately impacted by criminal records. We've known for many years that these changes were not helping Canadians. They were not making our communities safer. And they were, unfortunately, part of the systemic and structural racial discrimination that exists within the criminal justice system that was impacting very negatively on so many vulnerable Canadians. In our most recent speech to this from the throne, the government committed to taking steps to address the systemic inequities and inequalities in all phases of the criminal justice system. from diversion to sentencing, from rehabilitation to records. And that is why this is such an important step in fulfilling that commitment. Further, in Budget 2021, we've provided $88.2 million over the next 5 years to improve the pardon application process. And today, we are introducing Bill C-31. When passed, this bill will reduce barriers to accessing a pardon for people with a criminal record who have served their sentences and are now living as law-abiding citizens in our communities. This new legislation will help ensure that the pardons program works fairly and is effective in helping people reintegrate back into society. It will amend the Criminal Records Act to reduce wait periods for obtaining a pardon from 5 years to 3 years for summary conviction offenses, the less serious offenses, and from 10 years to 5 years for indictable offenses. It will also ensure that those who are convicted of the most serious offenses will be ineligible for the pardon system. For the first time, for example, terrorism offenses for which a sentence of 10 years or more has been imposed will become ineligible for pardon. And for life and indeterminate sentences, as well as sexual offenses against children, ineligibility will in fact remain. The bill I introduce also proposes that late payment of a fine or any other monetary penalty that was included in the sentence does not restart the wait period. And we are not simply stopping at legislative changes, important as they are. Today, the government is also announcing its intent to significantly reduce the application fee to amount more accessible to the vast majority of Canadians. And as I said in 2010, that was set at $50, and it was determined at that time to be accessible. The fees currently that are imposed have put it out of reach for far too many Canadians. We are also investing in a program of modernization for the Parole Board of Canada, including developing a new online portal to make the pardon application process far simpler and far quicker. And we are providing $22 million over the next 5 years to support community-based organizations that offer support services to help people complete an application for a pardon and to increase awareness of these support services and their role in the parole board. And this will help that people have access to the right information about the pardon process. It will reduce reliance on third parties, for-profit companies that are providing these services, often with somewhat misleading information and charging exceptionally high fees for their services. Today, we are also signaling our intent to explore the automated sequestering of some criminal records for less serious offenses for those who are living crime-free. And in particular, we're speaking of non-indictable summary conviction offenses for those types of offenses which are not violent and which we believe should be dealt with in a far more efficient way. We are working closely with the provinces, territories, municipalities, and key criminal justice stakeholders as we undertake this important work. And these changes will make a real difference for Canadians who have served their sentence and are now living law-abiding lives. They will prioritize public safety, but they will also help people reintegrate into society. They will create a fairer system for all Canadians. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions you may have, and I'm now very pleased to turn this conference over to my colleague and friend, Minister Bardish Chagger.
Merci à mon ami et collègue, le ministre Blair. Bon matin, good morning. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. J'espère que vous allez tous bien et que vous restez en sécurité. As Minister of Diversity and Inclusion in Youth, it is within my mandate letter to support the Minister of Public Safety to introduce legislation that takes action to address systemic inequities in the criminal justice system, which is why I am pleased to join my friends, Minister Blair, as well as Parliamentary Secretary Lightbound, to introduce Bill C-31. We know that for far too long, the criminal justice system has disproportionately impacted Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities in Canada. That's why, under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, our government is committed to combat all forms of racism and discrimination and take long overdue action to address systemic issues in all aspects of society. A recent statement from the Parliamentary Black Caucus highlighted that Indigenous peoples and Black Canadians are no more likely to commit a crime than the general population. Yet the over-policing and over-incarceration of these communities continues. The numbers are shameful, and I encourage everyone to read through some of the data presented today to better understand just how grossly overrepresented Indigenous, Black, and racialized individuals are within the criminal justice system and the impacts that these laws have had on so many lives in their communities. Le système de justice pénale doit fonctionner pour tous les Canadiens, et notre gouvernement est déterminé à faire en sorte que ce soit le cas. Which is why I'm so excited to see Bill C-31 introduced. This bill is very important. For far too long, we have seen the significant impact of criminal records and the stigma associated to them, especially on racialized communities. These records, coupled with repressive socioeconomic conditions, can make it very difficult for individuals to find a job or adequate housing. With today's announcement, we are taking concrete steps to help remove systemic barriers to accessing a pardon, which is key in supporting a safe and meaningful reintegration. Through lowered wait times and a reduced application fee, we could help alleviate the stigma and the burden faced by individuals who have served their sentence and have demonstrated to be law-abiding citizens. It's also important to highlight that improved and broadened access to pardons would have a particular impact on Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities that are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. These reforms are consistent with Canada's anti-racism strategy and have been informed by legal experts, numerous equity-seeking groups and organizations, and were also advocated for by the all-party parliamentary Black caucus. Through Bill C-31, we are moving forward on our commitment to ensure that Canada has a criminal justice system that treats everyone equally. Un système de justice pénale plus juste, efficace, et assurant la sécurité de tous. We know that there is a long road ahead, and we stand together against all forms of discrimination. Our government is committed to dismantle systemic barriers so that we can build a more just and equitable society for all. Maintenant, je passe la parole à mon ami et collègue, le secrétaire parlementaire du ministre de la Sécurité publique et de la Protection civile et député de Louis-Hébert, Joël Lightbound. À vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à la ministre Chagger, au ministre Blair pour leurs remarques et certainement aussi pour leur leadership dans ce dossier qui est tellement important pour avoir un système de justice criminelle qui est plus juste et qui favorise une meilleure réintégration dans la société. Aujourd'hui, on annonce des changements importants qui vont avoir une grande incidence sur notre système de justice criminelle. Les pardons permettent aux personnes qui ont été reconnues coupables d'une infraction criminelle d'avoir leur casier judiciaire mis de côté, à condition qu'elles soient admissibles, qu'elles aient terminé leur peine, qu'elles aient respecté la période d'attente et qu'elles aient démontré qu'elles respectent la loi. Toutefois, entre 2010 et 2012, des modifications importantes à la loi sur le casier judiciaire ont eu pour effet de limiter l'accès au pardon. Ces changements ont allongé les délais d'attente avant que des personnes puissent faire une demande de pardon. Ils ont rendu certaines infractions inadmissibles au pardon et ils ont augmenté les frais de demande substantiellement. On sait depuis des années que tous ces changements n'aident pas les Canadiens et ne rendent pas notre société plus sécuritaire. Dans le discours du trône, le gouvernement s'est engagé à prendre des mesures pour remédier aux inégalités systémiques à toutes les étapes du système de justice criminelle, de la déjudiciarisation à la détermination de la peine, en passant par la réhabilitation et la gestion du casier judiciaire. De plus, le budget 2021 propose de verser 88,2 millions de dollars sur 5 ans pour améliorer le processus de demande de pardon. Et aujourd'hui, on présente le projet de loi C-31. Ce projet de loi vise à faire tomber les obstacles à l'accès au pardon pour les personnes ayant un casier judiciaire qui ont purgé leur peine et qui vivent de façon respectueuse des lois. Cette nouvelle loi va contribuer à assurer le bon fonctionnement du programme de pardon de façon équitable et de façon efficace. Il va modifier la loi sur le casier judiciaire pour réduire les délais d'attente pour obtenir un pardon, à 3 ans pour les délits mineurs et à 5 ans pour les actes criminels. Pour balancer l'accessibilité au pardon et la sécurité publique, les infractions plus graves ne seraient pas admissibles. Ces inadmissibilités comprendraient les condamnations pour les infractions sexuelles contre un enfant, les infractions terroristes dans lesquelles une peine de 10 ans ou plus a été imposée, et les peines à vie ou à durée indéterminée. Le projet de loi qu'on présente aujourd'hui propose également que le paiement en retard d'une amende générale ou d'une amende qui a été incluse dans la peine ne relance pas la période d'attente en vue d'obtenir un pardon. Mais on ne se prête pas aux changements législatifs. Aujourd'hui, le gouvernement annonce également son intention de réduire considérablement les frais de demande, potentiellement aussi bas que 50 $ afin de rendre le pardon plus abordable et de réduire les obstacles financiers. On investit dans la modernisation des programmes de la Commission des libérations conditionnelles du Canada, y compris l'élaboration d'un nouveau portail en ligne pour simplifier et accélérer le processus de demande de pardon. De plus, on fournit 22 millions de dollars sur 5 ans aux organismes communautaires qui offrent des services de soutien pour aider les gens à remplir une demande de pardon et pour sensibiliser davantage à ces services de soutien et au rôle de la Commission des libérations conditionnelles. Ça va permettre de s'assurer que les gens ont accès à l'information appropriée sur le processus de pardon et ça va permettre de réduire la dépendance à l'égard des organismes à but lucratif tiers qui fournissent des renseignements parfois trompeurs et qui facturent souvent des frais très élevés pour leurs services. Aujourd'hui, on signale également qu'on explore la possibilité de mettre de côté automatiquement certains casiers judiciaires pour des infractions moins graves, pour ceux qui mènent leur vie en respectant la loi. On entend à ce chapitre travailler en étroite collaboration avec les provinces, les territoires, les municipalités et les principaux intervenants en matière de justice criminelle au moment où on va entreprendre ces travaux. L'annonce d'aujourd'hui va faire une grande différence pour les Canadiens qui ont purgé leur peine et qui vivent leur vie dans le respect de la loi. Pour ces personnes, un pardon, ça peut signifier la différence entre une réintégration réussie dans la communauté ou un retour vers la criminalité. Les réformes qu'on propose sont fondées sur des données probantes et ce qu'on annonce aujourd'hui donne la priorité à la sécurité publique. Ça va contribuer à soutenir la réintégration de personnes qui respectent la loi, ce qui est au bénéfice de tous. Je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre attention et maintenant, je pense qu'on est prêt à passer à la période de questions, sauf erreur.
Oui, merci. We'll now open the floor to questions. Nous allons commencer la période des questions et réponses. To give everyone a chance to participate, please limit yourself to one question and one follow-up, and begin by identifying yourself and naming the media outlet you represent. Operator, we're now ready for our first question. S'il vous plaît, notre première question.
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. Veuillez appuyer sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. Notre première question est de Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. À vous la parole, please go ahead.
Bonjour madame, bonjour messieurs les ministres. En faisant ça, vous êtes en train de renverser ce que le gouvernement Harper avait fait sous son gouvernement. La question, c'est pourquoi est-ce que vous croyez qu'en étant plus souple, ça va permettre d'avoir des rues plus sécuritaires?
Yeah, perhaps I could begin in responding to that. You know, I would like to believe that it was not the intention of Parliament in 2010 and 2012 to introduce measures that would make create an injustice and create a situation where records suspension or pardons were ineligible to poor people, to racialized people, and to Indigenous people. But unfortunately, an unintended and perverse consequences of the decisions that were made a decade ago has done exactly that, and it has actually created a situation where people who have convictions for relatively minor offenses, you know, things like simple possession of drugs or perhaps an administrative offense such as failing to appear in court. You know, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, 74% of the people who are actually applying for pardons have never served a single day in jail. They've never been sentenced to a single day of incarceration, and yet they carry the heavy burden of a criminal record throughout their entire lives. And so what the unintended consequence of that has been is that for so many Canadians who can't financially afford to make the application, or who, for various reasons, have been excluded, such as racialized and Indigenous people, their opportunity to reintegrate back into society following the completion of whatever sentence they may have received has been severely impeded. You know, if you can't get a job, if you can't get into decent housing, if you can't get into the appropriate educational institution, your opportunity to reintegrate fully into society and to become a fully contributing member is being significantly restricted. That has a very negative effect on public safety. If we want to create situations, and we really do believe in rehabilitation of offenders and reintegration of offenders back into society, I think we've got to give them a clear path, and I don't think it was intended to restrict their access to pardons to prevent that reintegration. And so we're fixing something that Parliament, I think, did not intend to cause, but the result has been real. The evidence is overwhelming that it's had a very negative impact on a significant portion of Canadians who otherwise want to lead exemplary and contributing productive lives. This is the path forward.
Oui, est-ce que quelqu'un peut répondre en français? Comme la question était en français, est-ce que quelqu'un peut répondre à cette question-là avant que j'envoie ma deuxième question, s'il vous plaît?
Oui, certainement, M. Noël, avec plaisir. Je pense que le ministre Blair l'a expliqué avec beaucoup d'éloquence, mais ce qu'on a observé, et c'est peut-être une conséquence certainement inattendue des changements ou une conséquence indue des changements qui avaient été apportés à la loi sur les casiers judiciaires entre 2010 et 2012, c'est qu'on a vu que ça a eu un impact disproportionné sur des parties de notre population déjà marginalisée. On peut penser, par exemple, aux populations autochtones, noires, et que bien souvent pour des offenses relativement mineures, par exemple possession simple, par exemple, comme l'exemple qui a été cité par le ministre Blair, un manquement à se présenter en cours, des gens qui autrement ont servi leur peine, respectent la loi, se retrouvent quand même avec un casier judiciaire au-dessus de leur tête qui les empêche d'avoir des opportunités à une réintégration pleine et entière dans notre société. Et ce faisant, ça n'aide en rien la sécurité publique du Canada qu'on ait des gens qui, justement, sont condamnés à rester en marge en raison du casier judiciaire. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on apporte ces changements aujourd'hui. Puis, une des statistiques qui est très pertinente, c'est que 74 des gens qui ont un casier judiciaire au cours des 5 dernières années n'ont pas passé un jour en prison. Pourtant, ils ont quand même ce casier judiciaire au-dessus de leur tête.
Je m'excuse, M. Lightbound. Pardon. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the ministers are going to need to take a quick pause. There is a vote that they'll need to take part in, and then we'll come back shortly to finish this event. So désolé, mais les ministres doivent aller pour faire un petit peu de travail au champ commun, puis il va retourner sous peu.
We will stand by and we'll come back with Mr. Lightbound, I hope. Thank you.
Ministers and Mr. Lightbound, when ready, please let us know and we'll restart the press conference.
It's Minister Blair. I have returned and I'm ready to go back anytime. Let me know when my colleagues have also rejoined us and we'll go together.
Yeah, so I just voted.
I'm here too.
Let's
All
go.
right. So please turn your camera on and we'll get started. Ryan, over to you.
Okay, merci beaucoup. We're back. Sorry about that, everyone. We'll go back to Mr. Lightbound, who was answering a question before I rudely interrupted him. Mr. Lightbound.
Oui, merci. En fait, juste pour compléter en réponse à votre question, M. Noël, ce qu'on constate, c'est qu'au cours des 5 dernières années, 74% des gens qui ont appliqué pour un pardon sur leur casier judiciaire n'avaient pas passé une journée en prison. Pourtant, ils gardent ce casier-là souvent très longtemps, selon nous trop longtemps, et ça empêche ou ça nuit à une réintégration réussie en faisant en sorte que ça cause des obstacles, par exemple, à l'emploi, à l'implication dans la communauté, des fois à se trouver un logement même. Donc, pour nous, d'accélérer le processus de pardon pour des offenses plus mineures, c'est très utile justement à prévenir des dangers de sécurité publique parce que ça ne pousse pas les gens qui ont un casier judiciaire pour ce type d'offense à se tourner vers la criminalité en leur permettant une réintégration réussie. Donc, c'est l'objectif du projet de loi C-31.
Merci. En relance, d'abord, vous avez dit que vous allez réduire les frais pour appliquer aussi bas que 50 $. J'aimerais savoir est-ce que vous avez déjà choisi quel montant ce sera. Et aussi, quelles sont les statistiques sur lesquelles vous vous basez pour dire que vos changements vont améliorer la réintégration?
Oui, bien, il faut savoir que le frais de... Je ne sais pas si le ministre veut répondre aussi en premier, là, puis que j'y aille après. Minister Blair, did you want to answer?
I think it's a very... Thank you very much, Joël. I think it's a very straightforward thing. We saw with the imposition of the much higher fees, we saw a 57% reduction in the number of applications, and we know for an awful lot of people that expense, and it's a considerable expense, put pardon application right out of reach. And so I don't think the law should discriminate against those who are poor, those from racialized and indigenous communities who are far more significantly impacted. You know, the burden and the impact of a criminal record for people who live in some of the disadvantaged communities in Canada, either financially or through various types of social exclusion. We acknowledge the impact of systemic and structural barriers and racist barriers within our criminal justice system, and I think it is an obligation of government to look at those impacts and to look who it's actually affecting, and I think it's an important point. Rehabilitation and reintegration of all offenders back into society is a key cornerstone of our public safety strategy, and we know that as a result of youthful indiscretion or sometimes the circumstances of people's lives, they can run afoul of the law and end up with a criminal conviction. But that criminal conviction, once they've served their sentence, should not hold them back from reintegrating into society. And frankly, I think we are all better served if those people have access to education, to jobs, to decent housing, to be able to live fulsome and productive lives. And so making sure that by sort of leveling the financial playing field here, like the very high fees that were charged meant that only people who could afford it were able to apply for a pardon. And that's wrong. And so we want to make sure that this is truly accessible to all Canadians, so that they can benefit from, if they're now living law-abiding lives and an appropriate period of time has passed, we want to make sure that the access to pardon is available to all Canadians.
Monsieur Noël, si vous voulez peut-être une réaction en français, juste pour réitérer ce que le ministre Blair vient de mentionner. On a vu, après l'augmentation des frais de 2010 à 2012, une réduction des demandes, des applications pour un pardon, une réduction de 57%. Pour nous, tous doivent être égaux devant la loi. Il ne devrait pas y avoir d'obstacles financiers à pouvoir avoir une réhabilitation puis une réintégration réussie dans la société. Il faut savoir que les gens qui appliquent pour un pardon ont servi leur peine et démontrent qu'ils respectent la loi. C'est deux critères fondamentaux avant de pouvoir même appliquer. Et Donc, et pour nous, le niveau de 50 $, ça vise, c'était ce qui était avant l'augmentation des frais, mais ça vise à justement éliminer cet obstacle pour que tous aient accès à une réintégration réussie.
Donc, ça sera 50 $ et pas autour de 50 là.
Aussi bas que 50 $, le montant n'est pas fixé.
Et je vais juste ajouter
Thank you. Oh. Allez-y.
Je vais juste ajouter qu'il y en a assez de rapports qui sont informés de la recherche des données, qui sont écrits par les experts, qui ont dit que c'est la chose à faire. Nous savons, avec ce travail-là, que nous devons prendre les étapes pour répondre aux issues systémiques dans notre système. Donc, c'est la chose à faire, mais il y en a plusieurs de rapports pour voir que c'est la chose de faire.
Thank you. We'll take our next question, please, and the next one in English, please. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you. Our next question is from Charlie Pinkerton from iPolitics. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good morning, all. Before my question, I just want to say that these press conferences are made very difficult when journalists do not have access to the actual legislation ahead of time. So in the future, it would be great if we could have a technical briefing beforehand, before the ministers speak. That would be very helpful to us to be able to formulate good questions. On to my questions, however. This bill and with the bill that was tabled in February, which the number of I forget, but is linked closely to this one. That bill has not moved along, and this is of course being introduced very late in the parliamentary calendar, in a time where it seems, or sort of all indications are pointing that a federal election in the fall is likely. So with that being said, and with what Minister Blair said about the importance of these sorts of things and the government's agenda around anti-racism policies as a whole being important to it, I'm just wondering how you sort of square that with also, not really prioritizing, and this goes back to what Minister Rodriguez said this morning as well, but not actually prioritizing these in terms of passing them. So how do we sort of view this as more than just sort of lip service and posturing on these issues when they're not actually being moved forward with, or we have no evidence of them being moved forward with in any legislative way?
Let me begin, if I may, Mr. Pinkerton. First of all, we are offering a technical briefing later on this morning, and although I understand your concern with not having received that prior to this press conference, I also have to respect the parliamentary process and privilege, and that bill was introduced into Parliament at 10 o'clock this morning. And then we made ourselves immediately available thereafter. But a technical briefing will be available to you. And if you have any subsequent questions arising from that technical briefing, and once you've had an opportunity to more fulsomely read the bill, I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to come back and ask other questions. With respect to the introduction of this legislation, I do very sincerely believe it's an important step forward in fulfilling our commitment to address systemic and structural racism within the criminal justice system. And I agree with you. It's part of a number of other significant legislative initiatives, such as Bill C-22, which is the one I think you referred to. Those are very important measures. I will tell you that, we're not planning for anything other than doing our jobs. We've made commitments to Canadians that we will bring forward appropriate legislation that we believe is going to make a real difference for Canadians in particular, in the removal of systemic and structural racism within the criminal justice system and in many other aspects of our society. And so we're focused on getting that work done. We've introduced this legislation now. I'm very hopeful that Parliament will turn its attention to it and deal with it quickly. I think those parliamentary processes are important and appropriate. We want to get this bill into the hands of committee and to allow Parliament to do its important work. We're certainly focused on getting the job done, and we're going to continue to do the job, notwithstanding that certainly during this past several weeks, it's been somewhat challenging. We've just gone through another procedural vote in the House of Commons while we're trying to continue with that work, but we're going to stay focused on doing our job. On doing our job for Canadians and serving Canadians as we have committed to do. We'll continue to introduce important legislation and we'll continue to work hard to get that legislation passed.
Okay, thank you. On Yeah, sorry. On a different topic, Minister Blair, you were not a part of ministers yesterday who spoke to the media when Minister Hajdu shared details about or sort of looking to the future about what's going to happen with Canada's borders. I'd like to hear from you on that, given that you'll be heavily involved, particularly on the idea of a national or I guess a federally produced vaccine passport document. Is this something that might be scannable at borders? Any other information along those lines for how that would work would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks very much again. And just to be clear, all of the restrictions that we have imposed upon our borders, which are very extensive and among the strongest of any country in the world, have always been informed by the advice of our Public Health Agency of Canada. They are driven by the health because they are guided at all times by the advice and the evidence that we receive from the health and scientific community. That's why Minister Hajdu has quite appropriately had the lead in this matter, because although my agencies enforce the rules, those rules are based on the evidence and the advice that we receive from our scientific experts. I think that's what Canadians expect of us. I can also tell you that we obviously are recognize the importance of vaccination and the impact that vaccination, fully vaccinated travelers can have on improving the situation at our borders. There are a number of different approaches to that, but certainly for our border service officers to be able to verify and confirm that people are in fact fully vaccinated. We've been doing a great deal of work on that. As you may be aware, we currently are using the ArriveCan app in order for travelers to supply us and provide our border service officers with verifiable information with respect to their eligibility to travel and pre-test and post-test information, for example. And so we've been working very hard to make sure that we can also have the utility within the ArriveCan app in order to verify and confirm that people are in fact doubly vaccinated. But I also want to advise that there's a great deal of other work going on because we're working internationally with our partners, with the airline industry. There's a great deal of work that is underway to ensure that I think one of the great benefits of a fully vaccinated population is that we will be able to use that information to inform decisions made about eligibility for transit at our borders. And so we're making sure that we have the technology and the tools in place in order to facilitate that in the most efficient way possible. One of the things, of course, I'm also concerned about is the impact on processing times. We want to maintain efficiency at our border as well as protection for our health situation in this country. And so we're making sure that we're fully integrating the use of digital technologies and verifying that information. I will have more to say for that as that work rolls out. But again, I conclude my response by saying that everything we do will be informed and based upon the health and science advice that we receive from the Public Health Agency of Canada, our various advisory committees. I think that's what Canadians' expectation is, that these aren't political decisions. They're evidence-based scientific decisions made in the best interest of Canadians' health and safety.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. We'll take our next question. Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Our next question is from Kevin Gallagher from CTV National News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, this question is for Minister Blair. I just would like to know how this new legislation might affect current ongoing initiatives to deliver pardons. Let's focus, let's say, specifically on issuing pardons to those who had cannabis convictions. So, like back in March, there was a criticism that just fewer than 400 people had been pardoned under this new system put forward to, erase criminal records for those who had cannabis charges in the past. There was some criticism that number was quite low. I mean, how do you think this new legislative initiative could help existing pardon programs like that?
Yeah, Kevin, I think you raise some important issues. We did, as you're aware, introduce legislation that for those with a cannabis conviction for simple possession, we waived the fee entirely and we eliminated the wait period. But we still saw that administratively people were not applying because, and again, it's in a recognition that the forms were somewhat inaccessible to some people, and for whatever reason they chose not to make application for that record suspension and pardon. And so we've also examined that experience. We want to ensure that we are making it financially accessible, but we're also significantly reducing the administrative burden to create an online application process that we believe will be far more accessible. We're making changes for how the Parole Board of Canada is the agency responsible for administering the pardon system in Canada. We are making significant administrative changes to make their processes far more efficient. We're investing in some of the community-based organizations that help Canadians make these applications, and I think that all of those measures will make the pardon process far more accessible. And then finally, let me point to an initiative that we are undertaking where we talk about record sequestering, and it essentially allows for the expiry of summary conviction offenses, which are convictions for less serious offenses. There's been some very good work done on that, but we recognize that we have to engage more fulsomely this summer and over the next few months with important stakeholders, including the provinces and territories, who are often the people or the organizations responsible, or the jurisdictions responsible for holding these records. And so there will be consultation with the provinces and territories with how we might deal far more efficiently with those records. And frankly, I believe, and I've been involved in the criminal justice system for very, very many years. I know that there are lots and lots of Canadians who, as a result of some youthful indiscretion or the circumstances that once existed in their lives, they have criminal convictions. They've served their sentences. They've paid their dues. But the burden of that criminal record just sticks with them. And sometimes they don't even recognize the consequence of that criminal record because they may not be aware how it's limiting their opportunities through employment, in housing, in education, even to travel, until it does. And so recognizing the unfortunate impact that those criminal records for less serious matters can have on Canadians throughout their entire life, we're going to do everything possible to make a record suspension system accessible to them. And for those records, which really are for convictions, which do not have any implication for public safety, they're not of concern to the police or for the criminal justice system, but they continue to hold people back. And we want to make sure that we deal with those records in the most efficient and appropriate way possible. And that's the work that we're going to continue over the next few months. This legislation, I think, brings about some very important changes, but let me acknowledge that there is more work to do, and we see a path forward for that as well. But it will require a continued, very targeted engagement with the provinces, territories, various stakeholders. I can assure you there's been a great deal of work done on that. We think that there is even more opportunity to improve the system.
Just a follow up, I'm just trying to understand which of these initiatives, when you talk about the administrative changes, a lot of that is seemingly regulatory, something that can be done without legislation. So I'm just wondering what this legislation will accomplish in terms of bringing forward the goals that you're laying out here. I'm a bit, because it seems like a lot of this can be done without this legislation and maybe could be done on a different timeline. So I'm sorry, I just need a little bit of clarity there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, first of all, some of it is regulatory. Reducing the fee charged for example, is something that I'll be taking to Treasury Board, and those decisions have not yet been completely completed, but that work is well underway, and we're hoping to be able to speak to that. It is, I think we clearly indicate today our intention to lower that fee to make it more accessible financially to all Canadians. We're also making other investments, which are not necessarily legislative or regulatory investments, for example, in those community organizations that provide support and help to people in applying for their criminal records. But there are important things in this bill. And for example, reducing the eligibility periods for summary conviction offenses from 5 years back to 3 makes it far more accessible. And in a more timely way, and even for indictable offenses, except for those which are excluded, such as child exploitation, cases of sexual offenses against children, certain terrorist offenses for which the period of incarceration sentence was over 10 years, and for life and indeterminate sentences, which will not be eligible. But for the rest, we're reducing that eligibility period from 10 years down to 5. That did require legislation in order. Those were the standards that were in place prior to 2010. I been involved in the criminal justice system for over 4 decades. I don't believe that the measures that were introduced in 2010 in any way improved public safety. And in fact, I think they had the perverse effect of actually making it more difficult for people to reintegrate into society. Legislation is required to change that. That's why we've introduced this bill. But there are a number of other regulatory and funding initiatives. And again, I've already referred to it, but there's also work that is also well underway, working with the provinces and territories to find a more effective and efficient way to deal with those less serious record summary conviction offenses for which we refer to as a record sequestering or an expiry regime based on certain schedules and certain offenses, not for those offenses for which the public would quite understandably be concerned, but for matters that were the result of, as I said, some youthful indiscretion or the circumstances that once existed in a person's life. When those circumstances change, we want to give those Canadians an opportunity to fully reintegrate back into society, to become contributing and productive members of society. So many of them lead otherwise now law-abiding lives. We want to relieve them of the burden of that criminal record that is no longer relevant to the life that they're now leading.
Thank you. We'll go to our next question. Prochaine question.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mike Lecoulter from Global News. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Thanks for this. Minister Blair and others, or whoever wants to tackle this, you've mentioned that 57% fewer applications for pardons since the changes under the previous government. I wanted to know, though, what other hard data do you have to show that the price for applying for a pardon was really the barrier or even the wait time to preventing more people from doing it?
Yeah, Michael, if I may begin, I think there's a number of barriers that we're addressing through the suite of measures that we're introducing today. I think the cost is an obvious one, and we've heard very clearly, and we have data. We've said we've seen a 57% reduction, but we've gone and spoken to stakeholders and to citizens who have who would otherwise have applied for a pardon, and they often cite the extreme cost. They also cite the complexity of the application process, and so many have had to turn to third-party agencies that provide a service, often charging very high fees as well. And so the cost has put it out of reach for many Canadians, and we've heard that from equity-seeking organizations, from advocates, and frankly, I think it makes a lot of sense that fee just made it inaccessible to a lot of people who simply couldn't afford it. And we shouldn't have a criminal justice system that provides justice only for the wealthy. It should be based on equity and fairness, and that's one of the things that we want to do. But in addition, the time limitations that were put in place also, I don't think were based on evidence, but put it out of reach for an extended period of time for many Canadians. And then finally, we also know in speaking to groups of people that the process of application can be quite challenging and difficult, and so we're streamlining that. I've also worked very closely and followed the advice of the Parole Board of Canada, which administers this program, and the chair's made it very clear to me that we needed to make changes through the legislation, through regulation, and through funding in how the Parole Board of Canada is able to administer these applications so that they can be dealt with in a timely and fair way. I think that's part of a justice system that we are trying to create here, and it is an acknowledgement that we indicated in the throne speech. But I think all Canadians have come to understand that there is real systemic and structural racism and disparity created for Indigenous and racialized people in this country, and we have a responsibility to look at all of every aspect of the criminal justice system, from as I said, the activities of the police, to the way in which our courts operate, to sentencing, to how people are dealt with while incarcerated, through the parole system and through the pardon system, to make sure that we deal with people in an appropriate and fair way. All of that, and to be very clear, my focus remains, of course, on maintaining public safety. But I think that helping people who have, at one point in their life, committed a criminal offense and for which they have been sentenced, they've served their sentence, there comes a point, and there must come a point, where we help those people reintegrate back into society and to put that behind them. That's really what a pardon system is all about. And so those are the changes that we're making through legislation, through funding, through a number of other significant administrative initiatives, and quite importantly, I think the work that still remains to be done with the provinces, territories, and stakeholders as we look at the issue of record sequestering for those less serious charges that quite frankly, the administrative burden of needs to be relieved of dealing with those. They should be dealt with in a more appropriate way.
And just as a follow-up, since we didn't get the opportunity to speak to you yesterday regarding easing of restrictions at borders, I wanted to ask you specifically about the Canada-U.S. border, and with vaccination rates approaching the benchmarks that have been set out by your scientific advisors and the medical advisors that are advising the government for protection of population, and with provinces clearly having detailed plans for the reopening of their economies, why hasn't the Canadian government spelled out plans for reopening the border with the U.S. so that industries that rely on tourists can actually plan for it? So far, there have been no rough dates, no objectives, nothing for these companies.
Yeah, Mike, it's one of the reasons that Mr. Haidu had her press conference yesterday to begin to spell out for Canadians and for those affected industries and the tourism sector. I know I've had extensive conversations, for example, with the communities and the border mayors across the country who have been really impacted by these border restrictions. We do set certain evidence-based criteria for changes in our posture at the border, and it is principally, I think, focused on two very important metrics. One is the vaccination rates, both first and second dose, the fully vaccinated, and how that a fully vaccinated traveler can be treated safely at the border, and in acknowledgement of the protection that they've been able to achieve through vaccination. We're also looking really carefully at case counts and hospital, the pressures on our hospitals. We want to make sure that the measures that we put in place, we put in place in order to protect Canadians. And we recognize that lifting those measures does require strong evidence and analysis. We did send, I think, a clear message that as we reach these metrics, we'll be able to carefully, informed by that evidence and that advice that we're receiving from the Public Health Agency of Canada, to begin to lift restrictions. And the first restrictions I know the minister spoke of yesterday will be for those travelers who are fully vaccinated. But I also want to assure you, we're going to be careful, because our first priority is and has to be the safety of Canadians. We're also consulting with the provinces and territories, many of whom have different opinions on how we should move depending on their own circumstances. But we have a responsibility to ensure that this is done safely. I will also advise that I and my officials are in very regular contact with our international partners, and particularly with the United States, because we do share a 9,000-kilometer border. There's 117 land border points of entry that we manage between our two countries. We want to make sure that continues to be done in a way that can provide assurance of the health and safety of Canadians, and at the same time we recognize the impact that this is having on communities. And so we'll continue to move forward, and I'm confident we'll be able to provide even more information in the days and weeks to come as that evidence accumulates and as we receive that advice.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Nous avons le temps pour une dernière question. Operator, last question, please.
Thank you. Merci. La dernière question nous vient de Boris Proulx du Devoir. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Bonjour. Vous avez participé tout à l'heure à un vote. Vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que c'est la fin de la session parlementaire. J'aimerais savoir si, à votre avis, le Parlement est assez fonctionnel pour faire adopter cette législation-là. Autrement dit, pourquoi la présenter maintenant?
Let me begin by speaking to that, and then I will invite my colleague, Joël Lightbound, to respond to the reporter from Le Devoir. First of all, this legislation is important. It fulfills, and it's part of fulfilling our commitment to address systemic and structural barriers within the criminal justice system that negatively impact racialized and Indigenous people. It's also, I believe, a significant initiative for public safety, and that's why the legislation is important. We've been working on developing that legislation, consulting with stakeholders for several months, and we bring forward that legislation with the full intention of passing it. I do have some confidence in Parliament's ability to pass important legislation, and I have great respect for the processes of Parliament in order to do that. We're introducing this legislation because it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do. I believe this is a very strong piece of legislation. I believe when passed, it'll create greater fairness and equity and justice for Canadians, but it will also contribute significantly to public safety. And so I would encourage my parliamentary colleagues to address this bill with the urgency that I think Canadians feel to make progress on issues of justice and equity in our country. But I also respect very much the processes that which will be initiated as of today with the introduction of this bill. And over to my colleague, Mr. Lightbound.
Oui, monsieur, ça dépend de vous, Monsieur Pro. Est-ce que vous avez besoin de compléments ou cette réponse vous suffit?
Ben, peut-être juste me dire si, à votre avis, le Parlement est assez fonctionnel en ce moment pour examiner ça.
Ben, c'est un projet de loi qui est très important, sur lequel on a travaillé depuis des mois, sur lequel on clenche depuis des mois avec, entre autres, beaucoup de consultations au niveau des groupes de la société civile pour voir comment est-ce qu'on peut améliorer le système de justice criminelle pour le rendre plus efficace, mais aussi plus juste, puis favoriser une meilleure réintégration de ceux qui ont purgé leur peine, qui ont montré qu'ils respectaient la loi pour des offenses souvent mineures. Maintenant, j'espère sincèrement qu'on puisse le passer et qu'il puisse se rendre en comité le plus rapidement possible. Puis je pense sur ce genre de projet de loi-là, je suis convaincu qu'on va réussir à trouver des appuis chez nos collègues de l'opposition aussi pour que ça procède rondement. C'est notre espoir.
Vous n'êtes pas sans savoir qu'il y a un problème de féminicide en ce moment. Il y a probablement eu le 12e féminicide à survenir au Québec depuis le début de l'année hier. J'aimerais savoir si l'obtention plus facile d'un pardon risque pas d'aggraver le problème.
Yeah, if I may respond, I absolutely not. And let's be very clear, we are not reducing the requirements for serious offenders. And in fact, we've retained parole eligibility for life and indeterminate sentences for sexual offenses against children. We've actually increased the ineligibility for example, for terrorist offenses for which the convictions are over 10 years. This is actually just simply making it accessible to people who at one point in their life may have had a criminal conviction but are now leading law-abiding lives. And let me also assure you, we share the deep concern with those terrible crimes that are being committed in Quebec and elsewhere across the country. It's part of our response. It's part of the National Action Plan dealing with gender-based violence. There has been a number of very significant initiatives taken and obviously more to do. But I am very confident that there is nothing in the legislation we introduced today that in any way negatively impacts those efforts to reduce the incidence of gender-based violence in Quebec or anywhere in Canada.
Thank you. That's all the time we have today. Appreciate your participation. You are all invited to take part in the media technical briefing on the same topic that will be starting in just a few minutes. Vous êtes tous invités à participer dans la séance d'information technique qui aura lieu dans quelques minutes. Thank you very much and have a great day.